Hello everyone, this is Lafayette Faust. I recently had the good pleasure to interview horror author James Joseph Jones, the author of the amazing series of books that begin with The Blessing of the Damned and continues with The Pale and the Opaque, Book 1 of the Weston Chronicles. James and I discussed several topics that range from his writing process to his idols and to his influences and of course his books. It was such a wonderful and long conversation that I've decided to break it up into smaller episodes. I hope that you give them all a listen so that you can hear the full interview. If you love your horror with a gothic vibe which includes a menagerie of vampires and ghouls that spans generations, I strongly encourage you to give him a read. I will put the links to his books in the episode description notes. And at the time of this recording, if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can download and read for free. Whether you get to download for free or not, please support James by buying and telling others about his work. So, with that being said, dear friends, I invite you to sit back, turn on a light, and prepare yourself. Hello, everybody. This is Lafayette Faust, and tonight I have something very special for you. I'm sitting with a good friend of mine and horror writer, James Joseph Jones. And I've had the pleasure of knowing James for a couple of years now, and I am in his home at the moment interviewing him. And I gotta say, James, you have been, so nice to my son. That's how I met you. You met my son, who is an artist. And you guys have done some work together. And last year, I can't believe it's almost been a year now, you invited he and I over, and we sat out in your lovely garden, and you introduced me to absinthe. I'm usually a wine guy and, beer guy, and, I like unusual wines and unusual beers and things like that, but I'd never had absinthe. And we sat in your garden, and we sat out there and we had a great conversation, and you did that. That is one of the coolest things I've done in a long time. So I really appreciate that. And this morning, I'm a garden guy too. I love flowers, I love herbs and stuff like that. And literally as I walked up your walk today to knock on your door, you have this massive sunflower plant growing right in front of your door. And sunflower just happens to be my favorite flower.
Did not know that.
Yeah. So what are the odds that a couple of dudes, manly dudes, are into the same kind of stuff?
I think when you came up, it was butterflies everywhere.
Yes.
Last year. That is a volunteer sunflower. I get a lot of the garden is volunteer. I mean, every year I garden, it attracts more birds and butterflies, and the birds crap, and I get this surprise mystery plant until it gets certain size, and then I realize, that's a Rosa Sharon, or
right,
man, that's a butterfly weed, that butterfly bush. All of those have been volunteer unexpected surprises in the garden. And I'm not quite sure what kind of sunflower that is. Last year I had about a 13-foot monster with a single bloom out back by the pond. Mm-hmm. But this one, it's a different breed, the one that gets multiple little flower heads on it. So they're constantly blooming in, blooming out. So, some of the best ones are the unexpected surprises.
I agree. I love that kind of stuff. And we're going to talk about your writing process here in a bit, but just my process, I love to write outside. I do. If I can find a quiet place in the shade where there's, flowers and stuff like that especially, I can write some of the darkest stories in those moments. I don't know what it is, but I'm one of those guys. I take a walk every day that the weather allows, and I walk in this beautiful neighborhood with homes like your home, where everybody's got well-maintained yards and gardens, and I literally stop and smell the flowers. Everybody's like, they know me now, but at first they just knew me as the weird guy that's sniffing the flowers.
Yeah, well, a lot of flowers I grow, unfortunately, don't have scents. The sunflowers, gladiolus, poppies, larkspur, things like that are extremely beautiful that unfortunately don't have any scent or much of a scent, at least detectable by humans or my nose. I've had people stop and take pictures of the cleome or spider flower, as some people call it, out by the closer to the street. So it's kind of, or people make positive comments when they're walking by, just doing their daily strolls. It's a good feeling. At least I'm not the only one getting some appreciation out of it.
Right. I find it interesting that horror writers like ourselves can appreciate. Well, I don't know. I don't find that interesting because you have to understand the beauty of life so that you can write about the darkness.
I never thought of it that way, but you're right. And I guess maybe that's why I like the Smiths so much. It's usually upbeat, very catchy, happy music with Morrissey's very grim lyrics, but it makes a wonderful concoction. So.
Yeah, it juxtaposes the two. Yeah, I like it. So as we get started, learning a little bit, now that we've talked about our love of nature and music, as we get to talk more about your writing, I got to say you've treated me today, with this drink. It's mead with a shot of what?
Berenjäger.
Okay. So, and what is this drink called?
I call it a bee sting.
All right, I love it. So we're gonna have to have more of this, and I'm probably either gonna have to crash or you're gonna have to drop me home when we're done with this because it is so good.
Some meads to me stand well enough on their own, and I don't know if it was this particular brand, and I'm not going to slam them or maybe the vintage, but I found it just a little weak, so I wanted to put some honey liqueur in here, which I've been doing that for years. I just played around. Well, it's both, they're both honey-based drinks, so
right.
They probably go well together. And
it does. It is so good. It's almost like a dessert drink.
Yeah, it's nice. It's chilled, on here. What has it been up to? Close to 100 degrees, at least with the heat index over 100 degrees for a few days. So
I think on the drive over my truck it said it was like 97.
It's disgusting.
Yeah.
I'm not built for this weather. I'm a spring and fall shoulder season kind of guy. So
that's me. And
I hibernate in the summer, except I go out in the early morning.
That's me.
That's when I get my gardening done until it's not hot. Usually it's just humid, so you sweat, and by the time the humidity is drying up, then it's just hot and you sweat. So you can't really win.
Right. The joys of being in the South.
Yeah.
All right. So with all that, let's get into your books. You've written some books, and if you would tell the listeners about what you've written and the universe that you're creating.
The series is called the Weston Chronicles. It's about and it spans about 300 years, starting in rural England in the early 1700s, and it is supposed to finish up in the early 21st century. In other words, contemporary times. There's a zero issue. It's sort of a prequel, which explains how one protagonist became a vampire. Most of my vampires don't have fangs; they just rip your throat out. There's so much.
So they're less romanticized, would you say?
I think it's scarier to have your throat ripped out than to have sort of be hypnotized and have your blood drained from you, whether you survive it or not. I thought, man, you get your throat ripped open, you're probably not going to survive.
Right.
I just figured. I love vampire folklore, the literature, the history, the myths and legends, on and on. But it's hard to find a new angle to write about an old theme. So that's just how they develop. Now later, as the series go on, the first one, the Blessing of the Damned, is sort of the origin story for the whole series. Each book focuses on a main character, and then the following book will pick up with a secondary or tertiary character and spotlight them.
Mm-hmm.
And each vampire is different. Some are self-created, some are created by their vampires, some are created by curses. So
And that's interesting when you say some are self-created. You said something earlier that Ethan and I, my son, we talk about all the time. How do you take a trope and make it fresh?
Yeah.
It's hard.
Very.
And I refuse to write anything that I can't at least make quirky, if I can't do something different on it. So yours being self-created, that's interesting. I've not seen a whole lot. I love vampires. I've not seen a whole lot of stories where they're self-created.
There are a couple different self-created vampires that's obviously explained in the stories. And they'll have different themes. One's a murder revenge. The second one is historical and romance. The third one is kind of adventure, romance. There are later the fourth one that I'm still working on. It focuses on a character who's a Nosferatu. So I've sort of kind of taken that. I don't really know much about the Nosferatu other than the old, Transylvanian, Carpathian legends and things that are easily enough found. But when I write, I'm one of those that's called a pantser. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the characters or the story is just dictating to me, and I've got the easy job of just transcribing, taking it all down. I've never really written with an outline, which I've thought about experimenting with recently with some writer's block that's hit me. Writer's block, I usually just ride out. I don't want to force things.
Right. It's interesting you bring that. I have a series of questions, and one of those questions was, what's your process? How do you deal with it? Are you one of those guys who outlines it, plots it out, or lets it go? It's rare that I know the ending of a story. And of course, we all have our favorite writers that we have been influenced by over the years. But, for me, Dean Koontz and Stephen King, I read a lot when I was young. I still read a lot of Koontz right now, not so much King, but both of them say, put a couple of characters in a situation and see what happens. When I started doing that as a writer, it became less, and it was always a labor of love, but it became less laborious and became, oh my God, what just happened? Like you say, you're just putting it down. It's there, you're putting it down. When that happens, to me, it's more exciting. And it sounds like that's what you're saying your process is.
Similar. I just sort of will get a picture in my head and start describing. Like I've had stories that started off, this will just be a nice little poem or a short story, and it doesn't stop there. I had always wanted to write novels. I started with, classic poetry, trying to emulate that, usually not so well. And then I got into kind of telling stories, but through, lyric prose. In other words, they are set up, you look at them on the paper, and it's a structured poem, but if you read it out loud, you might not necessarily hear those rhymes or feel that rhythm. So it's kind of a visual auditory play. And it wasn't until I met one of my best friends now, back when I got back from Germany in 2010, a novelist, Collie James. I started editing some of his novels, and one was already published. The publisher hadn't really done the best job of editing, and I went through and I said, if you want to republish this, here you go. I love editing. I learn a lot from authors that way, and plus I get to be one of the first ones to read a story.
Right. Yeah, that's fun.
But I dug out, we were going to meet out sometime and talk about writing, and I found this story that I kind of envisioned it to be a graphic novel. But I kept hitting writer's block back in 2013, and I just, 2003, and I'd stashed it until I found it 10 years later. And being around this guy, just talking shop, so to speak, he kept saying, you need to stretch this, pull that yarn a little farther. There's more here. There's more of a story. Let me know more. Tell me more. And it just started from there. And then I kind of went with it. So I think you've probably been like this, being around other comedians, being around other writers, any kind of artist. When they get together, even if they don't necessarily create anything, when they go home individually, they've sort of drunk drunk with muses or something, and it's a good time to. I found that shortly after meeting with kindred souls is a good time to write.
Yeah, I get inspired. Like tonight, when this conversation's over, I'm going to be deep into a story.
I'll probably be back on the television watching Midsummer Murders, but I want to get to that. I want to get to mystery detective stuff, which I know you've written.
Right.
But I want to go back to the garden. You say you write outside a lot.
Yeah.
I've always envisioned myself doing that, and I do sometimes in early spring or later fall. But I'm usually sitting on the couch later at night doing my thing.
Mm-hmm. See, I used to love writing at night. I was a night owl, right?
Mm-hmm.
Love being a night owl and reading at, or not reading, but writing at midnight. It's just something, if you're a horror writer, writing when it's dark and the moon is up, that's just, it sounds a bit cliche and maybe trite, but hey, that's where the inspiration comes from. But being married and having kids and your life cycle getting into a different flow, it's mornings for me. So if I can get up in the morning and find a good quiet place outside while it's tolerable, that's where it just flows for me. So with you, let's talk about your first book, the first one you published. The name of it is
Blessing of the Damned.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was looking at a couple of things in here. On Blessing of the Damned, you have this quote, and I love it. It's at the first of the book. It says, and I want to make sure it's because if this is the first book or the second book, because I took pictures so I could get this right. Let us maintain a stubborn vigilance over our souls, lest we damn them by giving into hatred. Is that from that first one, or is that the second one?
I think it's the second one, the pale and the opaque. But don't quote me on that. I mean, I have a horrible memory. That's why it's good to record all this stuff.
Right. Well, I thought you also had another quote. So I've got it right now. On the first one, dreams are but tiny glimpses of heaven. I like that. And nightmares, those of hell.
That is definitely Blessing of the Damned.
Yes.
That is the prequel.
Okay.
The first book.
So using that, so that quote, obviously, when you read that, and that's the front of the book, you've not even read the first bit of the story, it sets a tone. That's what I loved about that quote. So now
I never thought about that.
I know that what I'm getting into now, there's some depth to it. So I was excited when I read that quote. And then, when you say for, who's the book for? Right. There's a little part in the front of the book there. Again, we've not even read the first bit of the story. For the dead and those who have yet to join their ranks. Long live the dead. So when I know that I'm getting ready to read a horror novel, especially one about the undead, and I'm reading those quotes together, right out of the gate, James, you set the reader up for something fun.
I'd never realized that. I was aware of its sort of its relation to the content, but I never really looked at it in a philosophical manner like that. Maybe I was sort of subconsciously telling on myself. I don't know.
Well, that's good. I'm glad I was able to point that out to you because, we don't always have these moments. Every now and then I will get, comments or an email, but we don't have that opportunity to sit down across from people and say, what resonated with you? And I just think that as a writer, that's what impressed me with you right out of the gate was going, hey, he has set the tone. So good job. So now, so taking us into your first book, and I'm going to have links when this publishes. I'm going to have links out there, so hopefully people can just click on it.
Oh, wow.
And go to your site and buy the books and hopefully everybody that's listening will give him a shot. Listen to his stuff, or not listen to his, read his stuff. Listen to the episode. There's going to be good conversation coming, and just what you hear from the guy right now, when you read his stuff, you're getting a depth that I hope you can continue to hear in this conversation. So give us just a little bit, if you would, we're kind of headed there anyway, but give us a little bit more of what that storyline looks like without giving anything, a teaser, so to speak, of that first book.
It's about a young man. He's, living this rustic, rural, happy childhood in Yorkshire, England, in 1720s, and something horrible happens to disrupt that life. We're talking about a kid who's probably 10 years old, and he is taken in by relatives because he loses his parents, and he lives for revenge, basically, and so that probably links to that quote. And the whole book is based on tracking down his parents' killers between the United Kingdom and early colonial America, and he certainly has to learn along the way. He has a lot of goof ups and near misses and near death experiences, because these are hardened criminals, killers, pirates, those types of people that he's tracking. Many of whom have kind of settled down, quieted down, drifted apart, and they're no longer a band. But his revenge ends up costing him quite a bit of himself, spiritually, his soul, to some extent, perhaps. He is an example of a created vampire, which I won't give that away, how that happens. That's kind of the climax of the story.
Mm-hmm. Good.
And this character, Basil Desmond, he shows up in book one, which is the second one, The Pale and the Opaque, and kind of takes on an apprentice, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
He's fashioned himself into an aristocrat with the spoils he takes from his victims over the years, the decades. So,
It's fun. You're talking about that. That reminds me of a quote I saw the other day. It says, if you're a vampire and you're broke, then you just need to step out into the sun, because you've had decades to amass a fortune, kind of like what this character has done.
Oh yeah, he lets nothing go to waste, so to speak. He basically becomes, like this is often the case in revenge. What's the old worn out saying? When you go seek revenge, dig two graves, one for your victim, one for yourself.
Yeah.
It's not exactly that situation, but it costs him a lot of himself to accomplish what he goes out for.
Okay, and that's the first book.
That is the first book, the prequel, what I call issue 0.
Gotcha. All right, so the second book is called
The Pale and the Opaque.
Okay, and just give us an overview of that.
The Pale is a vampire, and the Opaque is a ghost, and how they meet. This book started off, this was the one I said started off kind of as a graphic novel. It stemmed from this, but I kind of later decided I needed a backstory. So that's where the 0 issue came from. But as I got into the story, once I got past that roadblock that was a decade old, it just sort of broke open, and the more I would write, the more, I would say, serious it became. So it was no longer sort of tongue-in-cheek, dark comedy. All of my books have some comedic moments in them. At least I think they're funny. I mean, the reader might think something else, but it's how are these two going to get together? How are they going to be together? It's kind of a weird situation when you have a material character and a mostly immaterial character. Mm-hmm. And they help each other resolve some of their pasts. I think she helps him with some of his anger toward Basil Desmond, the protagonist of the previous novel, because he made him a vampire against his will. And she has totally blocked out certain memories of her own traumatic experience in life. So she's just trapped in this other realm, fourth dimension, spiritual world, what have you, and she doesn't really understand why.
Mm-hmm.
So their blossoming relationship turns into something much more, and they really grow to depend on each other, help each other through their past trauma as their love grows.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So you got it sounds like between these two novels, you got a little bit of everything. You got Rip Your Throat Out.
Mm-hmm.
You got romance.
Mm-hmm.
You've got adventure.
Torture. Don't forget the torture.
Oh, the torture. Always got to have torture.
A lot of creative
What's a horror
torture.
novel without torture, right?
It's revenge torture. These aren't good guys that are getting tortured. So.
Good. So let's talk about when did you decide you wanted to be a writer?
I was hanging around the art scene in Knoxville back in the mostly early to late 90s, and I was around all these creative people, these singers, songwriters, actors, fine artists, visual artists, and poets. There was one guy, Chris, extremely talented but tragic real life person, who had a brilliant mind and was just his usual thing at the open mics was to read a chapter of the novel he was working on.
Cool.
And it was set in contemporary Knoxville, and he was just amazing, and I always wanted to write like that. I mean, I think he was heavily inspired by Cormac McCarthy, and it showed in his writing, and I later got into Cormac McCarthy because of him, and I could see that correlation. It's just writing off the cuff, writing from the soul, and I learned from this guy, you can't really have a chance at succeeding as a writer if you hide too much of yourself. And I was doing that in my poetry. I was like, well, I can put this off. It's not me. Almost the characters are too unrealistic for anyone to ever say, oh, that's really you. You're revealing your soul there or whatever. I was afraid to do that, and I realized no, it's too much of an of a barricade, an obstacle.
And you said it too. You were it was on the tip of your tongue, an inhibition.
Inhibition.
You don't. I agree. Look, I'll tell you, one of the most liberating things for me as a writer is when I realized I'm just going to pour into it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to pour into it because I was reading all these quotes, and one of the best ones, I want to say it was I forget who it was. He says, "Writing is easy. You just sit down at the typewriter and bleed." I think it was Hemingway that said that, and I was like, if I want to say something in this piece that I'm writing and I refuse to, then I'm not being true to myself. True. And when I decided I'm just going to let it go, I'm going to say what I want to say, whether it's quirky, whether it's deep, whether it's silly, or whether it's dark. Because there were times I wouldn't write there were scenes that I have written early on that I'm like, I chose to lighten them because they were too dark, because I didn't want people to think, oh my God, what's this guy thinking in his head? Right. But you got to be true to what you're writing, because it is cathartic to some people.
You can always just think about King. Does he really worry about what people think comes out of his mind? No.
Right. Well, one of my favorite quotes of Stephen King is, hey, look, everybody thinks because I'm a horror writer I'm this terrible guy. He goes, but I have a heart of a child. It's just in a jar at the desk. But if you think about the people who have truly made it in anything, any profession, especially of the arts, and have had longevity, they're being true to themselves.
And Hemingway was somebody, for me, you mentioned him, and I love that quote about you just sit down at the typewriter and you bleed, because I'm going to come right back to that bleeding. He was somebody, when I was in my 20s, I think I picked up The Old Man and the Sea, and I read a few pages, and I couldn't get into it, and I thought, how'd this guy ever get a damn publishing deal?
Right.
And I just finally picked up Hemingway last year, and I thought, whoa, this is brilliant. Whoa, I get it.
But that's the thing. I think you have to be... I was the same way with Hemingway, and Steinbeck as well. When I finally was at the right point in time in my life to where I could open up my mind and get what they were saying for the time, you're like, I get it now. I see why it's still around 100 years later.
And I'm inspired by a lot of older, older. I mean, I'm talking 18th, 19th, early 20th century writers. I love the classic, dark castle
Yes.
and the oppressive atmospheres,
Yes.
and I'm heavily influenced by the early romantics, by the gothic, and then later Victorian authors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and it's like the same way with my German, the reading that I do in German. It may be Goethe or it may be E.T.A. Hoffmann, and I just. A girlfriend once said to me, who's German, she goes, your German's a little stilted, it's fluid, but and I thought, well, I need to start reading more contemporary stuff, which it was almost harder for me because I'd gotten so used to old written German. Some of the books I'd read were even in the old Schrift. I just loved that. It's like going through back in a time capsule.
Mm-hmm.
But then I thought, well, this is probably going to negatively impact my writing. But then I thought, well, most people do read contemporary literature, and I do too.
Right.
Don't get me wrong. But I thought, well, something old, something new. This something old can be many people's something new. People who haven't necessarily explored these older genres. So I'm definitely heavily influenced by them, and I'm kind of linking that with the series. I've finished 3.5 of these novels now. I've only published the first 2. So I'm going from the early 1700s, that period that I kind of pick up in, with my
Which
reading.
Which is where your original inspiration came from as a
Right.
younger man, right?
And then bringing it all up to the 21st century, which is the goal once the 4th or 5th novel is completed.
This concludes the first part of the interview. Please come back for the next segment. I promise you it will be fun and insightful as we discuss James's love of all things horror.